7-year-old Mia's hands trembled as they gripped the cold metal bars of a cage. Yes, a cage, a dog cage, and inside it was a child. These stories are hard to believe, aren't they? But sadly, this was happening in a 21st century American villa. Mia was forced to live in a 1.5-meter cage designed for large breed dogs because of her stepmother Jessica's training method. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her head buried in her arms. "Stay quiet, little mouse," Jessica whispered, tapping the cage with her red-polished nails. "I have important guests today." But what Mia didn't know was that tonight everything would change. Because the millionaire living in the neighboring villa was about to discover something that would shake him to his core. The morning sun filtered through the basement window of the luxury home on Maple Ridge Drive, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Connecticut. From the outside, everything looked perfect: manicured lawns, expensive cars, the kind of life people dream about. But sometimes, the most beautiful facades hide the darkest secrets. Jessica Monroe adjusted her pearl necklace in the hallway mirror, her blonde hair perfectly styled for the charity luncheon she was hosting today. At 28, she had everything she'd ever wanted: a dead husband's fortune, a mansion, and most importantly, no one questioning her methods of raising his daughter. "Remember the rules," she hissed toward the basement door. "Not one sound." Down below, Mia sat in the cramped metal cage that had become her world 6 months ago. Ever since Jessica decided that a difficult child needed special discipline, the cage, originally purchased for a German shepherd that never came, now housed a 7-year-old girl whose only crime was existing. Mia's stomach growled loudly. Jessica had given her half a slice of bread and a bowl of water yesterday morning, and nothing since. The hunger pains had become so familiar that she barely noticed them anymore. What hurt more was the loneliness. The confusion of why the woman who was supposed to care for her treated her worse than an animal. The doorbell chimed upstairs, followed by the sound of Jessica's heels clicking across the marble floor. "Welcome, ladies." Jessica's voice transformed into honey-sweet tones. "So wonderful to see you all." Mia pressed her ear to the cage floor, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation above. These were the days she dreaded most, when Jessica had guests, because that meant she would be locked in the cage for hours, sometimes from morning until late at night, while Jessica played the role of the perfect widow and stepmother. "How is little Mia doing?" she heard one woman ask. "We haven't seen her around lately." "Oh, she's been staying with her grandmother upstate," Jessica replied smoothly. "The grief has been so hard on her, poor thing. Fresh air and family time seemed like the best medicine." The lie cut through Mia like a knife. Her grandmother had died 2 years ago. There was no one else. Just her and Jessica, and this basement, and this cage. As the hours dragged by, Mia found herself thinking about her father, David Monroe. He had been a kind man, a tech entrepreneur who built his company from nothing. When he married Jessica 8 months ago, Mia had been so hopeful. Finally, a mother figure, someone to fill the void left by her biological mother's death when she was just 3 years old. But David had died suddenly in a car accident just 2 months after the wedding, leaving everything to Jessica as his wife, with Mia as a dependent until she turned 18. The transformation had been swift and brutal. Within weeks, Jessica's mask had slipped completely. It started with small cruelties, cold meals, early bedtimes, isolation from friends. But when Mia accidentally broke a crystal vase while playing, Jessica's true nature emerged. "You're nothing but a burden," Jessica had screamed that night. "Your father is dead because of the stress you caused him. You're cursed, and everyone who loves you dies." The cage appeared 3 days later. "It's temporary," Jessica had said, her voice calm and clinical. "Until you learn to behave properly. Dogs learn obedience in cages, so will you." But temporary had become permanent. Mia spent 16 to 18 hours a day in the cage, only released for quick bathroom breaks and the occasional shower when Jessica deemed it necessary. Meals were pushed through the bars, usually scraps, sometimes dog food when Jessica felt particularly cruel. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. though the metal bars pressed painfully into her small body when she tried to sleep. It wasn't even the hunger, though her 7-year-old body was growing thinner by the day. The worst part was the voice in her head that had started to believe Jessica's words, that she was worthless, that she deserved this, that no one would ever love her. As afternoon melted into evening, Mia heard the guests finally leaving. Footsteps on the stairs made her heart race. Jessica was coming down. "Well, well," Jessica said, her charity luncheon smile now replaced with cold disdain. "I hope you enjoyed listening to how much everyone admires me for taking such good care of you." She set down a plastic bowl with some leftover salad scraps. "Here's your dinner, little mouse. Eat up." Mia reached through the bars for the bowl, her hands shaking from weakness. As she ate the wilted lettuce leaves, Jessica watched with satisfaction. "Tomorrow, I'm having the Blackwood family over for dinner," Jessica announced. "Richard Blackwood is considering investing in a project I'm developing. Very important people. You know what that means?" Mia nodded silently. It meant another long day and night in the cage. It meant perfect silence while Jessica played her role upstairs. "Good girl," Jessica said with mock sweetness. "See how well you can behave when you try." As Jessica's footsteps faded up the stairs, Mia curled up in the corner of the cage, using her thin blanket to cushion herself against the metal bars. Through the small basement window, she could see the lights of the neighboring villa. She often wondered about the people who lived there. Sometimes she saw a tall man with graying hair walking his garden, always alone, always looking thoughtful. He seemed kind somehow, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the gentle way he tended to his flowers, or how he always picked up litter that blew into his yard from the street. What Mia didn't know was that the man next door was Alexander Stone, a tech millionaire who had built his fortune in data security. At 45, he was known for his philanthropy and his keen eye for spotting problems others missed. He lived alone in his sprawling villa, having never married, dedicating his life to his work and his charitable foundations. And what neither of them knew was that tomorrow night, when the Blackwoods came to dinner, Alexander would be working late in his garden. And for the first time in months, he would hear something that would change both their lives forever. As Mia drifted off to an uncomfortable sleep on the cold metal floor of her cage, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose Jessica's horrific secret and finally bring justice to a child who had suffered in silence for far too long. Because sometimes, when darkness seems absolute, a light appears from the most unexpected place. And sometimes, that light comes in the form of a stranger who refuses to look away when everyone else has chosen to ignore the truth. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, Mia slept fitfully in her metal prison, dreaming of freedom she could barely remember. While just yards away, a man who would soon become her savior tended his roses under the stars, completely unaware that tomorrow would test everything he believed about doing what's right. Have you ever wondered how many children suffer in silence behind perfect facades? How many neighbors, friends, family members choose to look away rather than get involved? This story might be fictional, but the reality it represents is all too real for thousands of children around the world. The next morning brought another nightmare for Mia. Jessica appeared at the top of the basement stairs at 6 a.m., her heels clicking with deliberate menace against each wooden step. She wore a pristine white bathrobe and carried a small plastic bowl, the kind typically used for pet food. "Good morning, little mouse," Jessica cooed with false sweetness. "Today is very important for Mummy. The Blackwood family is coming tonight, and I need you to be extra quiet." Mia's stomach cramped violently from hunger, but she knew better than to ask for food. The last time she'd spoken without permission, Jessica had left her in the cage for 3 straight days with only water. "I've prepared something special for you," Jessica continued, sliding the bowl through the cage bars. Mia looked down to see chunks of dry dog food mixed with table scraps from last night's dinner. Her 7-year-old mind recoiled, but her starving body betrayed her as her mouth watered involuntarily. "Eat up, sweetie," Jessica commanded, her voice dripping with mock maternal care. Growing girls need their nutrition. As Mia forced herself to chew the tasteless kibble, Jessica knelt down to eye level with the cage. Now listen very carefully. Richard Blackwood is one of the most influential investors in Connecticut. His wife Margaret runs the Children's Welfare Foundation. Ironic, isn't it? She laughed coldly. If they hear even a whisper from down here, if they suspect anything unusual about this house, you won't just stay in this cage, I'll make sure you disappear completely. Do you understand me? Mia nodded silently, a tear rolling down her cheek. Good girl, Jessica said, standing and smoothing her robe. I have a full day of preparations ahead. The caterers will be here this afternoon, the florist at 3, and our guests arrive at 7 sharp. That's 13 hours of absolute silence from you. As Jessica's footsteps disappeared upstairs, Mia curled into a ball on the thin blanket that served as her only comfort. Through the small basement window, she could see the morning sun painting golden streaks across the neighboring yard. How was it possible that such beauty existed just feet away from her nightmare? Meanwhile, next door at the Stone Estate, Alexander was having his usual morning coffee on the garden terrace. At 45, he'd built Stone Security Solutions into a billion-dollar company by paying attention to details others missed. His analytical mind, which had made him rich, also made him an excellent neighbor, perhaps too excellent. He'd noticed things about the Monroe house that didn't quite add up. For instance, he'd never once seen the child who supposedly lived there. Jessica often mentioned her stepdaughter in passing conversations over the garden fence. But in 6 months of living next door, Alexander had never glimpsed the girl. She's quite shy since her father's death, Jessica had explained when he'd asked. Spends most of her time reading in her room or visiting relatives. But Alexander's security background had taught him to trust his instincts, and something felt wrong. Very wrong. Have you ever had that feeling that something was terribly wrong, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it? That nagging sensation that the perfect picture someone's presenting to the world is hiding something dark underneath. That morning, as Alexander tended to his prized rose garden, he decided to pay closer attention. He'd made his fortune by solving problems others couldn't see. Maybe it was time to apply those skills closer to home. At exactly 11 a.m., the first delivery truck arrived at the Monroe house. Elite Catering read the logo on the side. Alexander watched through his garden as uniformed workers carried in boxes of expensive ingredients. Jessica supervised from the front door, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile bright and welcoming. Beautiful morning, isn't it, Alex? She called over the fence, using the informal nickname that always made him slightly uncomfortable. Indeed it is, Jessica. Big dinner party tonight. Oh yes, very important guests. The Blackwoods. Do you know them? Richards, in investment banking. Margaret runs that children's charity. Lovely people. Alexander nodded politely, but something in Jessica's emphasis on the children's charity struck him as odd. Why mention that specific detail unless... His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the florist. As expensive arrangements were carried into the house, Alexander continued his gardening, but his attention remained focused on the activity next door. By afternoon, the preparations were in full swing. A wine delivery, a rental company dropping off additional chairs and tables, even a cleaning crew that seemed excessive for a house that already appeared spotless. Jessica was orchestrating everything with military precision. But it was at 4 p.m. that Alexander noticed something truly strange. He was pruning his hedges along the property line when he heard Jessica's voice through an open window. Sharp and angry, completely different from her usual sweet public persona. I don't want to hear a single sound, she was saying to someone. The consequences will be severe if you ruin this evening for me. There was no response that Alexander could hear, which struck him as odd. Who was she talking to? A housekeeper, a contractor? But there had been no other cars in the driveway since the cleaning crew left an hour ago. Curious now, Alexander moved closer to the hedge, pretending to examine a particularly stubborn branch. The window appeared to be at ground level, probably a basement. He could hear Jessica's heels clicking as she moved around below. Your food is there, Jessica continued. Water too. This will be over by midnight, and then we can go back to normal. But if the Blackwoods suspect anything, if they ask questions, ... The threat was left unfinished, but the menace in her voice was unmistakable. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Who was she threatening? And why did the conversation have such an ominous tone? As evening approached, the Monroe house transformed into a picture of elegant hospitality. Warm lights glowed from every window, soft jazz music drifted across the manicured lawn, and the scent of expensive cuisine filled the air. At exactly 7 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Richard Blackwood stepped out first, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit. His wife Margaret followed, elegant in a navy dress, her jewelry catching the porch lights. Alexander watched from his study window as Jessica greeted her guests with theatrical warmth, air-kissing Margaret and shaking Richard's hand with both of hers. "Welcome, welcome." Jessica's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I'm so thrilled you could come." As the trio disappeared into the house, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on his work. Something about the scene felt like a performance, too perfect, too rehearsed. And that threatening conversation he'd overheard kept replaying in his mind. Around 8:30 p.m., Alexander decided to take a walk around his property. It was something he did most evenings, checking his security lights and enjoying the night air. But tonight, his route took him along the fence line closest to the Monroe basement. As he approached the area where he'd heard Jessica's voice earlier, Alexander stopped. The basement window was slightly open, and he could see the faintest glow of light from below. More importantly, he could hear voices from the main floor above, Jessica and her guests engaged in animated dinner conversation. But there was something else, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a soft whimper. Alexander froze, straining to listen. There it was again, a quiet, muffled sound that might have been crying, but that was impossible. Jessica had said her stepdaughter was staying with relatives upstate. He crept closer to the window, his heart pounding. What he saw through the narrow gap made his blood run cold. In the dim light of a single bare bulb, Alexander could make out what appeared to be a large dog crate or cage. And inside that cage, curled up on a thin blanket, was a small child. A little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that hung loosely on her tiny frame. She was awake, but motionless, her eyes wide with fear as she stared up at the ceiling where the dinner party conversation continued above. Alexander's mind reeled. This was Jessica's stepdaughter, the child who was supposedly visiting relatives, the shy girl who was grieving her father's death. She was here, imprisoned in what looked like an animal cage in her own basement while her stepmother entertained guests who included a woman who ran a children's charity. The irony was so sick it made Alexander's stomach turn. As he watched in horror, the little girl shifted slightly, and Alexander could see more clearly the conditions she was living in. A plastic bowl that looked like it contained dog food. A water dish. No proper bed, no toys, no books, nothing that suggested this space was meant for a human child. For a moment, their eyes met through the window. The little girl's expression shifted from fear to desperate hope, as if she couldn't quite believe someone was actually seeing her. Alexander placed his hand against the glass, trying to convey that she wasn't alone, that someone finally knew. But then footsteps echoed on the basement stairs, and the child quickly curled back into her corner, feigning sleep. Alexander ducked below the window line, just as Jessica appeared in his field of vision. "Still quiet, I see," Jessica murmured, her voice carrying the same cold satisfaction Alexander had heard earlier. "Good girl, just a few more hours and the important people will be gone." She moved out of sight, and Alexander heard her heels clicking back up the stairs. Above, the dinner conversation resumed. Margaret Blackwood's laughter ringing out as she discussed her foundation's work protecting vulnerable children. Alexander remained crouched by the window for several more minutes, his mind racing. He needed to call the police immediately, but he also needed evidence. Jessica was clearly intelligent and manipulative. She'd been successfully hiding this horror for months, while presenting herself as a grieving widow and devoted stepmother. If he called 911 right now, she might have time to move the child or fabricate some explanation. He needed irrefutable proof of what he'd witnessed. Quietly, Alexander pulled out his phone and began recording through the window. The basement was dimly lit, but modern phone cameras were sophisticated enough to capture the scene. He recorded for several minutes, making sure to get clear footage of the cage, the child inside it, and the inhumane conditions. As he worked, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The lack of any sightings of the child, Jessica's immediate transformation from single woman to wealthy widow, the way she'd deflected any questions about Mia with vague references to grief and family visits. This wasn't just child abuse, it was imprisonment, torture, and probably fraud as well. Jessica was likely collecting benefits or inheritance funds meant for the child's care while keeping her locked in the basement like an animal. The dinner party above seemed to be reaching its dessert course, judging by the increased laughter and the clink of coffee cups. Alexander knew he had a limited window of opportunity before the guests left and Jessica's attention returned to the basement. He finished recording and began to back away from the window, planning to immediately call 911 from his house. But as he moved, his foot caught on a loose stone, sending it skittering across the ground. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Alexander froze, holding his breath. Above, the conversation had stopped. He could hear Jessica's voice, but couldn't make out the words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the dinner conversation resumed, but Alexander knew he'd lost his element of surprise. If Jessica was as controlling and paranoid as she seemed, she'd be checking on her secret soon. He needed to act fast. Alexander hurried back to his house, his mind already formulating a plan. He would call 911 first, but he'd also call his lawyer, his contacts in child protective services, and anyone else who could ensure this monster faced justice. As he reached for his phone, one thought dominated his mind. How many nights had that little girl spent in that cage? How many dinner parties had Jessica hosted while a child starved and suffered just feet below her guests? And most importantly, would he be in time to save her before Jessica realized her secret was out? The clock on his kitchen wall read 9:47 p.m. The dinner party was still in full swing. But Alexander knew that time was running out. For the first time in months, Mia had hope. Someone had finally seen her. But hope could be the most dangerous thing of all if it was discovered too soon. Alexander dialed 911, his finger trembling slightly as he pressed the numbers. In a few moments, this perfect suburban evening would become something very different. 911. What's your emergency? I need to report child abuse, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. A child is being held prisoner in a cage at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. I have video evidence. As he spoke, Alexander kept his eyes on the Monroe house, where warm lights still glowed from the windows and soft music continued to play. Soon, very soon, that facade of perfection would crumble completely. And in the basement below, a 7-year-old girl named Mia was about to be free. The 911 dispatcher's voice was calm, but urgent. Sir, can you confirm the address again? Officers are being dispatched immediately. 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, Alexander repeated, his eyes never leaving the Monroe house where the dinner party continued in blissful ignorance. The child appears to be approximately 7 years old, confined in what looks like a large dog crate in the basement. She's severely malnourished. Are you in immediate danger, sir? No, but the child is. The woman holding her is currently entertaining guests upstairs. She has no idea she's been discovered. Officers will be there in approximately 8 minutes. Please remain on the line and do not approach the residence. Alexander's hands shook as he held the phone. 8 minutes felt like an eternity when a child's life hung in the balance. Through the Monroe house windows, he could see silhouettes moving around the dining room. The dinner party still in full swing. But then something changed. The music stopped abruptly. Alexander could hear voices through the open windows, but the tone had shifted from jovial dinner conversation to something more urgent. Had Jessica noticed something? Had she somehow detected that her secret was about to be exposed? Inside the Monroe house, Jessica was experiencing the first tendrils of panic. She'd been in the middle of serving dessert when she noticed Richard Blackwood checking his phone with a frown. "Is everything all right?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain light and concerned. "Probably nothing," Richard replied, but his expression was troubled. "My driver just texted that there are several police cars heading into the neighborhood. Moving fast, lights and sirens." Jessica's blood turned to ice. Police cars, in her neighborhood, moving fast. How strange, she managed, her hostess smile feeling like a mask that might crack at any moment. Probably just a burglary or something. You know how these gated communities can be one little incident and everyone panics. But Margaret Blackwood was now looking at her phone too. "Actually, Richard, I'm getting alerts from the emergency scanner app. Multiple units responding to, oh my goodness, it says child endangerment on Maple Ridge Drive." The coffee cup in Jessica's hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Maple Ridge Drive. Her street. Child endangerment. I'm sure it's nothing to do with us," Jessica said, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Perhaps we should move to the living room. I have some wonderful brandy, ... But even as she spoke, the unmistakable sound of sirens was growing louder, closer. The wailing grew from a distant whisper to an undeniable roar, and through the dining room windows, red and blue lights began to paint the walls in alternating colors of judgment. Margaret stood up from the table, her face pale. "Jessica, those cars are stopping outside." The sirens cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy with impending doom. Jessica's mind raced frantically. How was this possible? She'd been so careful, so meticulous. No one knew about Mia. No one had any reason to suspect. The doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite, social doorbell ring of dinner guests. It was the harsh, insistent sound of authority that would not be ignored. "Mrs. Monroe," came a voice from outside. "This is the Connecticut State Police. We need to speak with you immediately." Richard and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. Jessica stood frozen in place, her mind completely blank for the first time in months. Everything she'd built, everything she'd carefully constructed, was about to come crashing down. You know that feeling when your whole world is about to change, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. When months or years of secrets are about to be exposed in a single devastating moment. The doorbell rang again, followed by firm knocking. "Mrs. Monroe, we know you're inside. Please open the door." Jessica looked at her dinner guests, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I have no idea what this could be about." Margaret Blackwood, whose foundation had rescued hundreds of abused children over the years, was studying Jessica's face with the keen eye of someone who had seen panic and guilt many times before. "Jessica," she said quietly, "what's going on?" Before Jessica could answer, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. The police hadn't waited for permission. "Connecticut State Police," came the authoritative voice. "Anyone in the house needs to come to the front hallway immediately." Jessica's legs felt like water. This couldn't be happening. Not tonight. Not in front of the Blackwoods, whose opinion and connections she desperately needed. "We should go see what they want," Richard said firmly, already moving toward the hallway. Margaret followed, her expression growing more concerned by the second. Jessica had no choice but to follow, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. In the front hallway stood 4 police officers, all wearing the serious expressions of professionals dealing with a grave situation. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s with sergeant's stripes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Jessica Monroe?" "Yes," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm Sergeant Martinez. We have a warrant to search these premises based on credible reports of child endangerment. We need you to step outside while we conduct our search." "Child endangerment?" Jessica's voice pitched higher. "I don't understand. There must be some mistake." Margaret Blackwood's eyes widened. "Jessica, where is Mia, your stepdaughter?" The question hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Jessica's carefully constructed lies were about to crumble in front of the one person whose respect she most desperately needed. She's visiting her grandmother," Jessica stammered. "Upstate, I told you that, but Sergeant Martinez was already speaking into her radio unit to proceed to the basement. Unit 3, secure the perimeter. Meanwhile, in the basement, Mia had heard the sirens, the voices, the heavy footsteps above. For months, she'd dreamed of rescue, but she'd stopped believing it was possible. Jessica had convinced her that no one cared, that no one was looking for her, that even if someone found her, they wouldn't believe her story. But the sounds above were different tonight. These weren't Jessica's usual guests. These were voices of authority, voices that demanded answers rather than accepting polite lies. When she heard heavy boots on the basement stairs, Mia curled up tighter in her cage, unsure whether to hope or hide. Jessica's threats echoed in her mind. If anyone ever finds you, I'll tell them you're dangerous, that you hurt yourself, that you can't be trusted around normal people. The basement door opened, and bright flashlight beams cut through the dim space. Jesus Christ, came a male voice, rough with shock and anger. Officer James Chen, a 10-year veteran of the force and father of 2 young daughters, had seen many disturbing crime scenes in his career. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of a 7-year-old child imprisoned in a dog cage, surrounded by pet food bowls and a thin blanket that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice automatically shifting to the gentle tone he used with his own children. "My name is Officer Chen. You're safe now. We're here to help you." Mia looked up, with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him with the wariness of an animal that had been trapped for too long. Officer Chen radioed upstairs. "Sergeant, we found her. 7-year-old female, confined in a dog crate in the basement. She appears malnourished and traumatized. We need EMS down here immediately. Is she responsive?" came Sergeant Martinez's voice through the radio. Chen knelt down near the cage, noting the padlock that secured it shut. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" For a long moment, Mia just stared at him. Then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, she whispered, "Mia. Hi Mia. I'm going to get you out of there right now, okay? You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong." As Chen worked to cut through the padlock with bolt cutters that another officer brought down, he kept talking to Mia in soothing tones. "You know what, Mia? There's a really nice man next door who was worried about you. He's the one who called us. His name is Mr. Stone, and he's been taking care of his garden, hoping to see you." Mia's eyes widened slightly. The kind man with the flowers. He had seen her. He had cared enough to call for help. The lock gave way with a sharp snap, and Chen carefully opened the cage door. "Can you come out, sweetheart, or would you like me to help you?" Mia's legs were cramped from being confined for so long, but she managed to crawl out of the cage on her own. When she stood up, Chen was shocked by how thin she was, how her clothes hung on her tiny frame like fabric draped over a skeleton. "When did you last eat a real meal, Mia?" She looked confused by the question, as if the concept of a real meal was foreign to her. "Jessica gives me food," she said quietly. Chen's jaw tightened as he looked around the basement, taking in the dog food bowls, the lack of proper bedding, the absence of anything that suggested a child lived here. This wasn't just abuse, it was systematic torture. While Officer Chen was gently coaxing Mia out of her prison, Sergeant Martinez was dealing with Jessica's increasingly frantic denials in the main hallway. "I don't understand what you think you're going to find," Jessica was saying, her voice rising in pitch. "Mia is visiting her grandmother. I have phone records, I can show you." "Ma'am," Sergeant Martinez interrupted. "We have video evidence of a child confined in your basement. The evidence was provided by your neighbor, who witnessed the situation firsthand." Jessica's face went white. Alexander Stone. That nosy, interfering. How had he seen anything? She'd been so careful about the basement windows, so meticulous about SOUNDPROOFING ... Margaret Blackwood was staring at Jessica with growing horror. As someone who worked with abused children every day, she recognized the signs of someone whose carefully constructed lies were falling apart. "Jessica," Margaret said quietly, "tell me the truth. Where is Mia?" Before Jessica could answer, Officer Chun's voice crackled through the radio. "Sergeant, we've secured the victim. 7-year-old female, appears to have been confined for an extended period. She's malnourished, but responsive. EMS is on the way." The words hit the hallway like a physical blow. Richard Blackwood stepped back from Jessica, as if she were radioactive. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Victim." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "There's been a mistake. Mia is... She's troubled. She has behavioral issues. Sometimes she needs... discipline... "Ma'am," Sergeant Martinez said firmly, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights continued, Jessica's perfect facade finally cracked completely. The gracious hostess, the grieving widow, the devoted stepmother, all of it dissolved to reveal the monster underneath. "You don't understand," she said desperately to Margaret. "She's not normal, she's difficult. Her father spoiled her, and after he died, someone had to teach her how to behave in the real world." Margaret Blackwood, who had dedicated her life to protecting children, looked at Jessica with more disgust than she'd ever felt for another human being. "You put a 7-year-old child in a cage and fed her dog food. There is no explanation, no justification, no excuse for what you've done." Upstairs, the paramedics had arrived and were gently examining Mia in the living room. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a clean blanket, while EMT Sarah Rodriguez checked her vital signs. "Can you tell me how you feel, sweetheart?" Sarah asked. "Does anything hurt?" Mia looked around the living room where Jessica had entertained her guests, where she'd served dinner to people who had no idea a child was starving in the basement below their feet. The room looked different now, somehow smaller and less intimidating. "My tummy hurts," Mia said quietly. "It hurts all the time." Sarah nodded, making notes on her chart. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, psychological trauma. This child would need extensive medical care and therapy to recover from what she'd endured. "We're going to take you to the hospital," Sarah explained. "The doctors there are going to make sure you're okay, and they're going to help your tummy feel better. Does that sound all right?" Mia nodded, then looked toward the front door where she could hear raised voices. "Is Jessica going to come with us?" "No, sweetheart. Jessica won't be coming with us. She won't be able to hurt you anymore." For the first time in months, Mia felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. As the paramedics prepared to transport her to the hospital, Mia looked through the front window and saw a familiar figure standing by the garden fence. The kind man with the flowers, Mr. Stone, was talking to one of the police officers, gesturing toward his house. When he looked up and saw her through the window, he smiled and raised his hand in a gentle wave. Mia, after a moment's hesitation, waved back. It was a small gesture, but it represented something enormous. The first voluntary human connection she'd made in 6 months. The first interaction that wasn't based on fear or punishment, but on simple kindness. Outside, Jessica was being placed in the back of a police car, her hands cuffed behind her back. The designer dress she'd worn to impress the Blackwoods was wrinkled and stained with tears. "This is all a misunderstanding," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "I was trying to help her. She needed structure. Her father would have wanted... But nobody was listening anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime undeniable. Margaret Blackwood stood on the front lawn, tears streaming down her face as she watched the ambulance prepare to leave. In 30 years of child welfare work, she'd seen many horrific cases, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about the knowledge that this had been happening right under everyone's noses, hidden behind the facade of suburban perfection. Richard had already called their driver and cancelled their other evening plans. There would be no business discussions tonight, no investment opportunities. There was only the stark reality of what they'd witnessed and the knowledge that they'd been dining above a torture chamber. Alexander Stone approached them cautiously. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, I am Alexander Stone, the neighbor who called this in. I wanted to apologize for disrupting your evening." Margaret turned to him, her eyes red with tears but also shining with something that might have been admiration. Apologize. Mr. Stone, you saved that child's life. If you hadn't been paying attention, if you hadn't cared enough to investigate, God knows how much longer this would have gone on." As they spoke, the ambulance pulled away, carrying Mia toward a future that was uncertain but infinitely brighter than the basement cage she was leaving behind. The police cars followed, transporting Jessica toward a justice system that would ensure she never had the opportunity to hurt another child. And in the sudden quiet that settled over Maple Ridge Drive, Alexander Stone stood in his garden and realized that sometimes the most important investments aren't financial at all. They're the moments when we choose to pay attention, to care, to act when we see something wrong. Tonight, that choice had saved a life. 6 weeks after that horrific night on Maple Ridge Drive, Mia sat in a hospital bed at Connecticut Children's Medical Center, her legs swinging freely over the edge as she colored in a book that Dr. Sarah Chen had given her. For the first time in months, she was wearing clothes that fit properly, a soft pink pajama set that one of the nurses had brought from home for her own daughter, but decided Mia needed more. The transformation was remarkable, yet fragile. Mia had gained 12 pounds, her hair had been properly cut and styled, and the dark circles under her eyes were finally beginning to fade. But the deeper scars, the psychological wounds that couldn't be healed with IV fluids and proper nutrition, those would take much longer to mend. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric psychologist assigned to Mia's case, had been working with traumatized children for 15 years, but Mia's case had affected her more deeply than most. The level of systematic psychological torture the child had endured was almost unprecedented in her experience. "How are you feeling today, Mia?" Dr. Chen asked, as she settled into the chair beside the bed. Her voice warm but professional. Mia looked up from her coloring book, where she'd been carefully staying within the lines of a picture of a house with a garden. "Better," she said quietly. "My tummy doesn't hurt anymore." "That's wonderful. The doctors tell me you've been eating well." Mia nodded, then looked down at her hands. "Dr. Chen, when I leave here, where will I go?" It was the question Dr. Chen had been dreading. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was so much better than Mia could possibly imagine, and she was afraid to let the child hope too much too soon. "Well," Dr. Chen said carefully, "there's a very nice man who's been asking about you every single day since you came here. He's been waiting patiently to meet you properly when you're feeling better." Mia's eyes widened. "Mr. Stone, the man with the garden." "That's right. Mr. Stone has been working with social services and the courts. He'd very much like to become your guardian, if that's something you'd want." For a moment, Mia didn't respond. The concept of someone actually wanting to take care of her, someone choosing to have her in their life, rather than seeing her as a burden, was almost too foreign to comprehend. "He wants me," she whispered. "He wants you very much," Dr. Chen confirmed. "He's been learning about what you like, what you need, how to help you feel safe. He's even been taking classes about caring for children who've been through difficult experiences." As if summoned by their conversation, there was a gentle knock on the door. Alexander Stone peeked his head in, holding a small potted plant with tiny white flowers. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice careful and gentle. "I brought something for Mia, if that's all right." Dr. Chen smiled. "Perfect timing. Mia, would you like to show Mr. Stone your coloring book?" Over the past 6 weeks, Alexander had been transformed as much as Mia. The successful businessman who had lived alone for decades, focused solely on his company and his charitable foundations, had discovered a capacity for love and protection he hadn't known existed. He'd spent those weeks not just waiting for Mia to heal, but preparing himself to be what she needed. He'd read every book on trauma recovery in children, consulted with child psychologists, and even had his house completely redesigned to be child-friendly while still feeling safe and welcoming. "I brought you a jasmine plant," Alexander said, setting the pot on Mia's bedside table. "Dr. Chen told me you like flowers. These ones smell beautiful when they bloom, and they're very easy to take care of, just like how we're going to take care of you." Mia touched one of the tiny white blossoms with her finger. "It's pretty," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "Mr. Stone, why do you want me?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. How could a 7-year-old child have been so damaged that she couldn't understand why someone would want to care for her? He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining enough distance that Mia wouldn't feel trapped, but close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Mia," he said, "do you remember that night when you saw me through the basement window?" She nodded. "I saw you too, and in that moment, I knew that you were the bravest, strongest little girl I'd ever seen. You survived something that would have broken many adults. You never gave up hope, even when things seemed impossible. That's why I want you, because you're extraordinary, and you deserve to have someone who sees how amazing you are." Tears began to slide down Mia's cheeks, but, for the first time in months, they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief, of finally being seen as something other than a burden or a problem to be solved. Have you ever witnessed the moment when someone who's been broken begins to believe they might be worth saving? When the walls built by trauma start to crack, letting in just the tiniest ray of hope. Dr. Chen watched the interaction between Alexander and Mia with professional satisfaction and personal joy. In her years of practice, she'd seen many potential guardians who meant well but weren't truly prepared for the complex needs of a traumatized child. Alexander was different. He understood that healing would be a long process, that setbacks were normal, and that love alone wasn't enough. It had to be combined with patience, consistency, and professional support. "Mia," Dr. Chen said gently, "would you like to hear about what your new home would be like?" Mia looked between the two adults, still cautious but with growing curiosity. "My new home." Alexander pulled out his phone and showed her pictures he'd taken of his house. "This is where I live. It's right next door to where you used to live, so you'll still know the neighborhood. But it's much bigger, and it has a library, and a music room, and a big kitchen where we can cook together." He swiped to the next photo. "This is the room that would be yours. I had it painted yellow because Dr. Chen told me that's your favorite color. And see this big window. It looks right out into the garden, so you can watch the flowers grow." Mia studied the photos with the intense concentration of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. The room in the pictures was beautiful, sunny and bright, with bookshelves and a desk, and a bed that looked impossibly soft and comfortable. "The bed is really mine?" she asked. "Everything in that room would be yours," Alexander confirmed. "Your books, your clothes, your toys. No one would ever take them away or tell you that you don't deserve them. And I wouldn't have to. I wouldn't have to stay in a cage." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Even after weeks of therapy, Mia still sometimes seemed surprised by basic human decency. "Never," he said firmly. "You would never be locked up or confined or punished like that ever again. I promise you that, Mia." Dr. Chen could see that Mia was getting overwhelmed by the enormity of what was being offered to her. "What do you think, Mia? Would you like to visit Mr. Stone's house sometime soon, just to see how it feels?" Mia nodded slowly. "Could I bring my jasmine plant?" "Of course," Alexander said, smiling. "In fact, I was hoping you could help me with my garden. I have lots of flowers, but I think they might grow better with someone special to help take care of them." While Mia was beginning to heal and dream of a future, Jessica Monroe was experiencing a very different kind of awakening. The trial had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence that made any defense impossible. Alexander had not only provided video evidence of Mia's imprisonment, but investigators had found extensive documentation of the abuse. Jessica's own security cameras, ironically installed to monitor the house while she was away, had recorded months of evidence showing her systematic torture of the child. The forensic evidence was damning. Medical records showing Mia's severe malnutrition, veterinary receipts for the dog cage and feeding bowls, financial records showing Jessica had been collecting Mia's inheritance and survivor benefits, while spending nothing on the child's care. District Attorney Patricia Williams had prosecuted many child abuse cases, but few had generated the public outrage that Jessica Monroe's trial had sparked. The case had made national news. with child advocacy groups using it as an example of how abuse could hide behind facades of respectability and wealth. Your Honor, Dar Williams said during the sentencing hearing. The defendant systematically tortured a 7-year-old child for 6 months. She confined her in a dog cage, fed her pet food, and psychologically abused her to the point where the child believed she deserved this treatment. This wasn't a moment of anger or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated, ongoing cruelty against the most vulnerable member of our society. Jessica sat at the defense table, a far cry from the perfectly groomed socialite who had hosted dinner parties while a child suffered below. Her expensive clothes had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Her manicured nails were now short and unpolished, and her face showed the toll that months of incarceration and public disgrace had taken. Her defense attorney, struggling with what even he privately acknowledged was an indefensible case, had attempted to argue for leniency based on Jessica's lack of prior criminal history and claims of mental health issues. Your Honor, my client was overwhelmed by suddenly becoming responsible for a child while grieving her husband's death. She made terrible decisions, but she's not a monster. Judge Patricia Morrison had heard enough. At 58, she'd spent her career protecting children through the legal system, and she'd rarely encountered a case that disgusted her more. Ms. Monroe, Judge Morrison said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. You had every resource available to get help if you were struggling to care for a child. You could have contacted social services, hired caregivers, or asked family members for assistance. Instead, you chose to imprison a 7-year-old girl and torture her for your own psychological gratification. The judge continued. The psychological evaluations show that you experienced pleasure from controlling and tormenting Mia. You enjoyed her fear and helplessness. That's not grief or overwhelm, that's sadism. Jessica's face remained impassive, but her lawyer noticed her hands shaking slightly as the judge delivered her fate. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Additionally, you are ordered to forfeit all assets derived from David Monroe's estate, which will be held in trust for Mia until she reaches adulthood. The gavel fell with finality. Jessica Monroe would spend most of the rest of her life in prison, and every penny she'd gained from marrying Mia's father would now go toward ensuring the child's future. In the gallery, Alexander sat with Margaret Blackwood, who had become an unexpected ally in ensuring Mia's welfare. The woman who ran the Children's Welfare Foundation had been so horrified by her unwitting participation in Jessica's facade that she dedicated herself to making amends. Justice Margaret whispered, as Jessica was led away in shackles. Finally, Justice. 3 months after the trial, on a bright Saturday morning in early fall, Mia stood in the garden behind Alexander's house, carefully watering a row of newly planted flowers. She wore jeans that fit properly and a sweater that Margaret Blackwood had bought for her, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, secured with a ribbon that matched her favorite yellow rain boots. The transformation was remarkable. The hollow-eyed skeletal child who had been pulled from a dog cage was now beginning to look like what she was, a healthy, intelligent 7-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. How are the marigolds doing? Alexander asked, approaching with 2 glasses of lemonade on a tray. They're growing really fast, Mia said, accepting her glass with a smile that was becoming more frequent and genuine each day. Mrs. Blackwood said, marigolds are good flowers for beginners because they're hard to kill. Alexander laughed. Mrs. Blackwood is very wise about flowers, and about lots of other things. Margaret had indeed become a regular presence in their lives, serving not just as a friend but as an additional source of support and guidance for both Alexander and Mia. Her foundation had also established a new program for identifying and preventing child abuse in affluent communities, using Mia's case as a catalyst for change. Alexander, Mia said, using his first name as he'd gently encouraged her to do. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever wish you hadn't looked through that window? That you'd just minded your own business? Alexander set down his lemonade and knelt beside her in the garden, his hands dirty from the morning's planting. Mia, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Before you came into my life, I had a big house and a successful business, but I was lonely. I didn't know what I was missing until I met you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You didn't just get rescued that night. We rescued each other." Mia considered this with the seriousness that still characterized much of her thinking. "So you're not sorry that your life got complicated?" "My life didn't get complicated," Alexander said firmly. "It got complete." As if to prove his point, Mia suddenly grinned and squirted him with the garden hose, soaking his shirt and causing him to yelp in surprise. She dissolved into giggles as he pretended to chase her around the flower beds, their laughter echoing across the garden that had become a symbol of growth and renewal for both of them. 6 months later, Alexander officially adopted Mia in a ceremony attended by Dr. Chen, Margaret Blackwood, and several of the police officers and medical personnel who had been involved in her rescue. Judge Morrison, who had presided over Jessica's sentencing, had the honor of finalizing the adoption. "Do you, Mia Monroe, want Alexander Stone to be your father?" Judge Morrison asked gently. "Yes," Mia said clearly, her voice stronger and more confident than anyone had heard it in the early days of her recovery. "I want him to be my dad. And do you, Alexander Stone, promise to love, protect, and care for Mia as your daughter?" "I do," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." When the judge declared the adoption final, Mia threw her arms around Alexander's neck, and there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Later, at the small celebration at their home, Mia stood in front of the group of people who had become her chosen family and asked if she could say something. "I want to thank everyone," she said, her voice still soft but steady. "For seeing me when I thought I was invisible, for believing I was worth saving when I didn't believe it myself, and for showing me that families aren't just about who you're related to, they're about who chooses to love you." She looked directly at Alexander. "Dad, thank you for looking through that window. Thank you for caring about a little girl you didn't even know. Thank you for saving me." Alexander wiped his eyes, not caring who saw his tears. "Thank you for being worth saving, sweetheart. Thank you for making me a father." Dr. Chen, who had been documenting Mia's recovery for a case study on childhood trauma and resilience, watched the interaction with professional satisfaction and personal joy. In her notes that evening, she would write, "Subject shows remarkable progress in attachment formation and trust development. Prognosis for full psychological recovery is excellent." But the clinical language couldn't capture what everyone in that room could see. A little girl who had been broken had been made whole again. Not just by medical treatment and therapy, but by the simple revolutionary act of being unconditionally loved. On a warm spring morning 5 years after her rescue, 12-year-old Mia Stone stood at the podium in the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt, addressing the annual conference of the National Child Welfare Association. She wore a blue dress that she'd picked out herself, and her hair was styled in the confident ponytail of a young woman who knew her own worth. "My name is Mia Stone," she began, her voice clear and strong. "And when I was 7 years old, I lived in a dog cage." The silence in the room was absolute. 500 child welfare professionals, social workers, and advocates hung on every word. "I'm not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for me," Mia continued. "I'm telling it because I want you to know that recovery is possible, that children who have been broken can be whole again. That love really does conquer all, but only when it's combined with action." She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with individuals throughout the room. "There are children like I was in your communities right now, behind perfect facades, in beautiful neighborhoods, in families that look normal from the outside. They're waiting for someone to see them, to care enough to look closer, to refuse to accept easy explanations for hard questions." Alexander sat in the front row, his eyes shining with pride. Beside him, Margaret Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Dr. Chen, now a close family friend, smiled with the satisfaction of a professional who had witnessed true healing. "My dad, my adoptive dad, says that the best investment anyone can make is in paying attention to the people around them, in caring enough to get involved when something doesn't seem right. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this: Don't look away. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't convince yourself that it's not your business. Mia paused, her voice becoming even more earnest. Because somewhere out there, a child is waiting in the darkness, hoping that someone will care enough to turn on the light. Be that someone, please. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. But more importantly, Mia's speech would be shared thousands of times on social media, would inspire new legislation protecting children, and would directly result in the rescue of dozens of abused children whose neighbors finally found the courage to speak up. That evening, as father and daughter sat in their garden sharing ice cream and watching the sunset, Alexander marveled at the remarkable young woman Mia had become. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I'm proud of us," Mia replied, leaning against his shoulder. "We did pretty good, didn't we, Dad?" "We did more than good, sweetheart. We did something miraculous." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, both father and daughter knew that their story had become something larger than just their own healing. It had become a beacon of hope for other children trapped in darkness, and proof that sometimes the most ordinary people can accomplish the most extraordinary acts of love. The little girl who had once been fed like an animal in a cage had grown up to be a voice for the voiceless. And the lonely millionaire who had looked through a basement window had discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of love we're willing to give and receive. Their story had started with horror, but it ended with hope. And in a world that often seems filled with cruelty and indifference, that transformation from nightmare to dream proved that goodness really can triumph. Love really can heal, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to pay attention to change everything. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the children in your own community who might be suffering in silence, then it's served its purpose. Child abuse happens everywhere, in every socio-economic class, hidden behind facades of normalcy and respectability. You have the power to be someone's Alexander Stone. You have the ability to see what others choose to ignore, to speak up when others stay silent, to act when others walk away, because somewhere right now, a child is waiting for rescue. And that rescue might come from the most unexpected source. It might come from you. Don't look away. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Be the light in someone's darkness. Be the one who cares enough to look through the window